Welcome to Syntax, folks. Today we have another episode for you on React Server Components. So we did episode 718 as an introduction to React Server Components, and now we're going to do another one specifically on actions in React Server Components. So form actions, server actions, whatever you're going to call them. We'll explain all of that is. Being able to call server code or run code on the client without having to do a whole bunch of extra work is honestly a game changer. I'm a big fan of this idea of actions in React Server Components. So it's not even just server. A lot of this is client-side stuff as well. And we're going to sort of dig into it, explain how it works, a lot of the use cases and whatnot. So buckle on up. How you doing today, Scott?
Doing great. We are right about to head out to Miami tomorrow, Wes. I don't know when you're heading out, but my family's heading out there, and we're bringing the whole crew along. So, hey, I'm stoked. We've never been. I'm sure the kids are going to have a blast going to museums and whatever they're going to be off doing. But you and I are going to be at React Miami, which by the time you're hearing this is long and gone, but pretty stoked to be out there. So, yeah, excited.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've been to a conference, probably about 6 months or so. So it seems like everyone's really stoked about this one as well. It seems like a really fun one. So I can't wait.
It's a somewhat busy conference season for me this year. I'm doing JS Nation. I'm doing React Miami, and then potentially doing another one. We're going to see if I can make it out to Utah. There's one in Park City at React Rally. So I'm going to see if I can do that or not, but yeah.
And in November, we are going to be in New York City doing another live Syntax as well. So
yeah, and potentially something else as well.
Pretty stacked. It's going to be pretty fun.
And if you are, sending data back and forth, you're, working with forms, you're working with data of any kind, sometimes that transmission, whether that is via the UI or the server, these lines are getting blurred, and your tools really need to get blurred as well. And that's why we use something called a Sentry, which is what this show is presented by, to track all of our data and how it works inside of our app. We look for slow queries, we look for slow routes, we look for slow form events and those types of things. And we're able to track at any given point if something went wrong in that process, regardless if it was happening on the server or the client or that kind of fuzzy area in between that now exists given how these tools work. So if you want error handling, exception handling, all kinds of instant replay, bug finding tools, head on over to sentry.io/syntax, sign up and get 2 months for free. All right, Wes, form actions. I don't know that much about React Server Components beyond what we've talked about. I get the general vibe. And in fact, go back and listen to episode number 718. That's syntax.fm/718 if you want to learn more about React Server Components in general. But, working with data is a big part of these things. Most websites, what do? They load data. They allow you to interact with the site. And many times when you're interacting with the site, you're sending data back to the server, then data comes from the server back to the client, and that whole process is something you do 100 times. If you're building anything, you do that a lot, especially if it's interactive. So I'm interested to hear exactly how form actions in React Server Components compare to the things that I'm familiar with, but also how they make my life easier.
Yes, I'm very excited about this. And I should say that everything we are talking about today is 100% React. It's not a Next.js stuff. There's one little thing I'm going to talk about at the very end in regards to caching and invalidating data that is in Next.js specific. But everything we're talking about today is just React, meaning that it will be and already is implemented in vanilla React as well as all the frameworks that are out there. So,
and a question with that though, Wes.
Yeah.
When you say vanilla React in this regard, what is the server component there in a vanilla React app in 2024?
Yeah. Server components is kind of a funny word in that because
I don't even necessarily mean the component as in like a React component, but like what is the server of a
Yeah.
vanilla React site if you're not using something like
Yeah,
Next.js.
what is the server?
Yeah.
The server can be anything. It can be a server that is running React on the server. It can be a build step. So like React server components don't necessarily need a server. They can be pre-rendered as part of a build step instead of actually being on the server, which is kind of interesting. But generally, yeah, you're going to reach for a framework that implements the whole server thing for you, whether that is Remix. We're going to start seeing stuff from them pretty soon on the React server components. Next.js, obviously, first to the party there, but there's a whole bunch of other sort of projects that are working on this right now. One of them, which I'm really excited to see, is the TanStack stuff. So he's been like chewing on this for probably a year now. I talked to him about Reactathon last year about it, and he's just like, not totally sure. And it seems like he's really has some ideas for how this should work. So what is the server? It depends. It depends, and you can implement it yourself as well with Vite. But it's still early days for that type of thing.
That's the hardest part for me with any of this, is when we're saying this is in vanilla React. It's like, well, what is the server there? I wonder if there ever becomes a point, which I kind of doubt at this point, but like, and we got all this React server stuff. Would React ever ship their own server?
That's a great question. And the answer to that is maybe. I don't know if they will, but the kind of interesting thing is that a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, server render components, form actions, server actions, all of that stuff is being added to React, which is something like I feel like I've been asking for that forever. I've been asking for an easier way to do forms. Like the way to do forms in React before this is like you got to do your own state. You got to listen for update functions. You got to like set state, and you have initial state, and like it's just like, why is this so hard that I need to reach for a third-party library to do it straight away? Like, why? The one thing that we do so much in this thing is have forms and submit them. Why is that not a first-party thing? And now it is. It's absolutely beautiful. So I'm pretty excited that this is being added, and it's not something that we leave up to framework land. So let's talk about it. Actions. They are often, you're going to hear the word form action and you're going to hear the word server action thrown around. But we're going to start peeled back a little bit from forms actions and server action, and we're just going to call them actions, right? Because actions are functions that can be run whenever, likely when a form is submitted, right? Like the hugest use case for server actions and form actions is when you submit a form and you want to run some code. This is going to be replacing a lot of your submit logic that you've had, which I was just saying, and they can run either client side or server side. So these are not just, this is not entirely for sending data to the server and getting stuff back. It can just run entirely client side, which is a very common use case where, all right, I have this form or I have this UI, and when somebody does something, I need to run a function that will generate some state. So I see like two huge benefits. Personally, I've built a couple things with them already. I have a couple sites in production using them. I see like sort of two huge benefits to this type of thing. Is first, actions allow you to tie state, which is your data, your submit handler logic, like what happens when somebody clicks a button or submits a form, and pending, which is often people use like use transition to create like a pending state. Often you are cobbling together your logic, your state, your pending into like a useEffect or using a third-party library. Actions allow you to sort of put that all together into a single function. And then the second huge benefit here is that it allows you to call server-side code from the client without any sort of APIs. And that's the massive benefit to me, is that you can wire up a button that says save user, have a user type into a form input, click that button, and you can bind that button to a function that runs on your server side. That function has database logic, validation, anything that you would normally do on a server, without having to do a GraphQL API, a REST API, like all of the overhead of that type of thing. So it's a massive productivity boost to be able to have like an RPC, which means remote procedural call. Being able to call server-side code from the client is such a benefit. I feel like I can just prototype stuff so much faster in React. And of course, like all of the other meta frameworks have this idea as well. Is just like on the SvelteKit site for syntax, we have all kinds of buttons in the admin area where you just click on the button and it runs some code server side and can relay the status and the pending directly to the client.
Yeah. And that was even the first time I saw anything like that was in Remix. And I remember trying those types of things and just being like, yes, this is what I've wanted.
Yeah.
I'm used to calling Mongo commands from the client in Meteor. So for me, like RPC feels very great. And I know that some people get a little skeptical because they've been working in a different flow for so long, but there's definitely a lot of just generally nice things that can come about, especially if your client and server are a little bit more like, I want to say, tightly coupled. For a little while we swung into this world where everybody's blog had its own API, and like, hey, if there's not like multiple things consuming your API, why do you have an API that's so tightly not coupled to your UI? Is that ever going to be a thing you'll actually need?
Totally. So actions, they're often tied to a form submit, but they do not have to be. Sometimes some examples of what you might want to use an action for is at the very basic, you want to have somebody click a button and increment a number by 1, right? Like that's the hello world of state management is incrementing. You might want to add an item to cart. When somebody clicks on a add to cart button, that might go to the server and add an item to the cart. It might just be entirely client side where you have like some state that is somebody's cart and you want to add an item to it. You might want to like a post, type your email in and subscribe to a newsletter. Send some metadata about, like, for example, if you are listening to this podcast and you reach every 15 seconds, there's a progress event that gets fired by the audio element, right? You might want to send that data to the server side, or you might want to log that data to local storage so that if somebody wants to reinstate it, you can save that data. It pretty much the whole CRUD thing, right? Create, read, update, delete.
Yep.
Of being able to map those functions to your validation and your database logic on the server is quite honestly the hugest benefit here. And that's what I think most people are going to be using them for.
Word. I have a question. Can you use these things outside of a server component? Can these be done in a client component?
Oh, yeah. They can be run anywhere.
Okay,
meaning
client-side,
that
server-side, but also
sometimes your actions are going to be server-only, meaning that they have the database logic inside of them. And sometimes your actions are going to need to be run on the client because it's something that only needs to happen inside of the browser because it is based on events, or it doesn't have to go to the server, right? Like there's a lot of stuff that happens only in the browser, and they can be totally done like that. So yeah, they can be run anywhere. Like a drag and drop might be a good example of something like that.
Yeah.
Using actions. Here's my next point. Actions can be called anywhere, but the most likely are going to be called in these 3 areas. 1, on a form submit. You pass an action to the action attribute of a form element. So you have a form element. You normally have an action that points to a URL on your server. What this will allow you to do is you can say action equals curly bracket, and you pass it the reference to the function that you've imported. And again, that function can be either some client-side code that needs to happen when somebody submits that form, or it can be some server-side code that happens when somebody submits the form. And they will progressively fall back. What's the word for that type of thing? Or progressive enhance, meaning that if you turn JavaScript off, they still will work because they have been bound to that.
And I do want to say, I think this may be a thing even more in the React world than outside of it. Forms. Forms are a
Yeah.
key component. If you're sending data around, hey man, forms. I know a lot of React folks just use buttons, or even worse, like a div, click, send an event, because it's easy, just send a fetch with a button or something like that. But hey, forms are great, and if your page is server-side rendered and you have a form, it will still work.
Yes, it's beautiful that you can use forms. That's also what I like so much about this API, is that it is built on forms and form data, meaning that you don't have to maintain state and JavaScript in order to send data to the server.
Yeah, back to the web,
That's the first one, form submit. The second one is you might want to call it programmatically in an event handler, right? So you use something like downshift to create a combo box, and you type something, and when somebody hits enter on an item in the combo box, you might want to programmatically submit that event handler. So that's the example of it doesn't have to be tied to a form. That's why they're not just called form actions. They're just called actions. And then the third one is in you could also run them in a useEffect. So if you have some other code that is sort of watching for a specific change, and you want to submit this action whenever that item changes, you can code up a custom useEffect to do that.
So they're not called form actions.
They're not called form actions. They are called actions.
Actions. All right.
And actions are functions.
I'm laughing because the episode title, Form Actions and Server Actions. So I'm
yes. That's I didn't want to call it just actions. Because
I know.
When you see them being used in documentation and everywhere, they're either called server actions or they're called form actions. So, but they are just called actions. And then we'll talk about what form and server actions are in just a sec.
Yeah. Can I actually just say even quickly, it's a huge missed opportunity to not call them reactions. I mean, come on.
You're right. Damn, that's a good one. Oh, that's like a good library if somebody wants to build a library that sits on top of this. Reusable, composable React actions for common use cases.
Got it.
I like it.
Perfect.
Using actions. So now, in order to use an actual action, you can, like I said, pass them to a form's action attribute. But if you want a little bit more control, you're going to use one or all of the following hooks. So the first one is the useActionState hook. This was previously in today, if you go to the React docs, it's going to say useFormState. And that has changed partially because of some comments I put on the GitHub, partially because they talked to Ryan Florence from Remix about it was kind of funky. I was learning it and I was like, this seems odd, where in order to get the status of is it pending or not? Is it currently being sent to the server and coming back? In order to get that data and in order to call it, it was two separate hooks. And you couldn't put them in the same component because one of them had to go inside of a form and one of them has to go above the form. And it's just
wow. Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense to me. So I wrote some comments on GitHub and the React team reacted to it and they changed the API to useActionState, which is much better in my opinion. I'm really excited about this. So useActionState is a hook. You pass it your action and it's going to return to you three things. First, the state of the action, and this could be a few things. So once you call an action, it either does something on the client side or it goes to the server side, and it's going to return to you some data, right? And that could be success messages. It could be some error validation that needs to be displayed to the user. It might be previous form state or initial state. So if you are trying to you filled out a form, it didn't work, you want to do it again, you can get the data from the previous submit. Or initial state is if you want to pre-populate some of the inputs in an action, you can do that with the useActionState. So the initial state is the first argument. Then you have the bound action itself. So you would pass that action to the form or the button click or the programmatic event handler. And then the third one is, most importantly, the pending state. So this is going to be a Boolean of, is this action currently running? And because actions are asynchronous, you can await inside of them. Likely you're going to be doing something like await database.save. You might be fetching an external API, things like that, right? And if that promise is currently pending, then you probably want to do things like disable the field set, or disable a button, or show a spinner, or like any number of things you want to do while something is currently pending. So it gives you a nice Boolean, and then you can use that Boolean anywhere in your page to display whatever it is you want. Like, for example, I was throwing up a toast message when it was pending, saying like saving blah 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 blah. And then when the data came back in the first argument that I talked about, then I would update that toast message to say item blah 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 saved.
Yeah, and that's really great, because the alternative to that is you create your own state variable. You set it to loading is equal to true right when you click that form, and then you set loading is equal to false on the state whenever it's returned. So this just gives you a nice little helper, handy little bit for that. One thing I really do love about this flow is the error message validation stuff, because, one of the things that working with forms, bad UX, people don't get right all the time. Form error messages, validation, something went wrong in the server process, returned, and maybe the form isn't responding the correct way. This makes it so easy to get that right, because as all you have to do is make sure your server returns a proper error message with whatever you want to say, and your forms become super reusable, because you can have a if error, check for error message, just display the error. I do this all the time in Svelte form action. So, I think this is a big win for a lot of like easy accessibility.
Yeah, I actually hooked this up with Drizzle Zod, and it was beautiful because I created my schema in Drizzle for the database, and then I got my types out of that, and then I used Drizzle Zod to also do the validation for it, and then I was able to send any errors to the client and line them up with the input. Sometimes you fill out a form and it just tells you at the top of the form what your errors are, and then some nice forms will highlight the actual field that is invalid. That is much nicer. I did find myself leaning a lot more on just like HTML validation because of the whole, sometimes your whole form is not a client component. Maybe it's just a server component, but it was a really nice flow to be able to do that type of thing. And I'll shout out Alex.js on Twitter. He's the creator of TRPC. He's doing a ton of research in this area right now of like, how do you make a good form library with this? And you don't need a form library, but he's sort of like looking at like, what are the patterns going to start to look like, where if you want to make a reusable bunch of components, what does that look like?
Yeah, totally.
Next hook we have here is useFormStatus. This is a hook that allows you to access if the form is being submitted. It must be used inside of a form element, and this will give you the information of if it's pending. So you might want to use that to, again, disable inputs, show a spinner. This previously was the only way to get information of if a form is being submitted or not, and that was a bit of a pain. So you might not even need this one if you don't need it, because you could also just pass this data down via props, but you do have access to it. You don't need to pass it down. You can put this, I think the idea is that you're going to have a single button component that you can use in any form. And if you want to make a reusable submit button component, you can use the useFormStatus hook to figure out if its parent form, whatever it is currently being submitted via the pending state. It also gives you access to the form data object itself, the method, which I can't figure out why you need that in the action as well.
Yeah. Hey, more info is not a problem, but yeah.
Yeah. Next, let's talk about actions themselves and their input. So just like a function, an action, whether it's a server action, whether it's a client action, whether it's a form action, can take in any data that you want. So most of the time, if you hook up an action to a form element, you're going to get a form data object. A form data object is, if you're not familiar with it, is a JavaScript API for, you can take an entire form with all of its inputs and all of the data that the user has taken in. You can convert that entire form to a beautiful object and have all of the data that you want. And what this will do is you have access to that whole object, and you can then pass that data into your database saves or whatever it is that you're going to do. So for many cases, you no longer have to use state, form handlers, on change, on input, default value, that annoying error where it's like there's no change handler tied to this, whatever that error was. I hated that one. You just pop a form on the page, give your inputs names and attributes, and when you submit the form, your action will receive a form data object, and you can use it however you wish. You can also programmatically pass other data to it if you want as well. If you're not using it with a form, you're just using it programmatically, you can, it's just a function. Like, actions are just functions. And you can use them with the hooks to get some of this additional functionality. So actions, like I said, they can run server or on the client. And how do you tell React that you only want this code to run on the server? Because like I said earlier, the killer feature of this is being able to write a function with server-side code in it. You can put raw SQL statements inside of this function. You can export it from a file, go into a client component, import it in, and just say on submit or action equals save user. And just like that, like being able to go from the server to the client. Of course, if your whole stack is in JavaScript, I'm curious if there will ever be like a PHP adaptation to this, but being able to just jump from server to client like Meteor did like 15 years ago is absolutely beautiful. So the way that you mark a function as being server only is by either inside of the action itself, and when I say action, it's a function, you write the words use server in quotes, and that marks that function as a server only function. And that will make sure that that code is never run client side. It's not going to import any of your server dependencies on the client side. And Next.js has really good errors around this type of thing where it says, you're trying to do this and you shouldn't have. What's more likely is you're going to have like a lib folder with all of your functions inside of that, and every single file inside of there, you're just going to put use server at the top of the file, and that marks that whole file as code that should only ever be run on the server. So usually I'll have like an actions.ts file, mark it as use server at the top, and then you write all of your updater functions and queries inside of that.
Yeah, that I think that, like you mentioned, just moving them to a separate file is probably for the best. I know people will co-locate, and that will be a thing, but that makes a lot of sense in terms of organization and making sure you're not leaking anything. I know that's a concern.
Yeah.
One thing that really bugs me is when people talk about this stuff in the context of PHP, and they're like, well, this is just PHP. It's like, well, call me when PHP is a client-side scripting language as well, because it's really giving us the best parts of PHP without, while being able to maintain the client-side aspect as well. So
yeah, it's really nice. And I think one thing that trips a lot of people up is that server components, by default, if you do not put a use client in that file is by default server only. And if you put a function in that file, so you have a server component file, you put a function in there, it will also be run on the client side. So you have to mark client components with use client, and you have to mark server actions with use server. And for a lot of people, they're all just like, oh, that's stupid. It's a kind of a funny way to do it, because components are server by default. And if you want to run a component on the client, you have to mark it with use client. But if you want to run an action only server side, you have to mark it with use server, right? It seems a bit bizarre, but part of it is like a security thing where you have to explicitly mark something as a use server. The reason we have that is because you're crossing the boundary from server to client, and you're connecting the two. And if you want to do something that is client side, like put it in an event handler, but you want the code to run server side, you have to explicitly mark them with that use server. So a little bit of a funky thing to sort of getting used to, but it starts to make sense after a little bit of a while. What do we got next here? Let's talk about optimistic state. So another hook we have here is called useOptimistic. Scott, do you want to give a quick explanation of what optimistic UI is?
Yeah. So optimistic UI is, the word optimistic here comes from the fact that you are optimistically thinking that this server-side action that you're doing will be successful, right? So let's say you have like a to-do list. You submit that to-do list. In an ideal situation, that to-do typically goes to the server, gets loaded in the database, and then that gets populated probably into your UI, like a typical to-do list, right? It would pop up and that server process can take some time. There's a round trip there. And users are, when they click something and it doesn't happen instantly, your users might try to click it again. That might think your app is broken. Your app is going to feel slow. On a bad network, that's going to take even longer and it's going to feel bad. So optimistic UI is the process of saying, hey, I feel like this thing is going to succeed. And therefore, I'm going to update the UI immediately with the success state. So even without getting the server database storage of that to-do was successful, you're still populating that to-do into your UI instantly. Therefore, the UI feels very snappy. And in a situation where that would then fail, you got to handle that. So it would remove it from the UI, or it would give an error message. There's various ways to handle that. But basically, the optimistic part of this whole thing is that you're handling your UI as if your server calls optimistically are going through.
Yes, that's a great explanation of that type of thing. And I love when apps have like an optimistic UI because you don't have to like sit there and wait. Even if it's 200-300 milliseconds, like a good example is if you just have like a to-do list or a chat app, right? In Slack. As soon as I hit enter in Slack, it's sent, right? 99.999% of the time, that message is going to be sent, right? And Slack will render it out as if it was sent, but they will also provide a little bit of UI being like, like it's not actually sent. Like it looks like it's sent for you, but maybe it's gray text. Yeah. Maybe there's a little spinner beside it. Maybe nothing, maybe they just show it. And if there is a failure, then they'll show some sort of UI to you.
Or maybe it tries again.
I'll retry as well.
Yeah, we do this in my habit tracker because that was the whole thing. You'd click it, and on network conditions that weren't great, it wouldn't necessarily even look like it was clicked. And you might click it again. That causes a whole host of issues. So yeah, optimistic UI, it really helps your applications. It's like cheating to feel faster. It's a great technique, yeah.
So useOptimistic works with your actions that you already have. And the way that it works is it takes in two things. It takes in one, your state. So your state might be, if we're talking about a chat application, it might be an array of messages that have been sent. So it takes in your existing state of the messages, and then it also takes in your action that needs to be submitted once somebody types in the box and hits enter, right? From that action, you get two things. You get your state with any optimistic state added to it, and you get a method for adding new optimistic messages. So the idea here is that useOptimistic is going to proxy your state and give you a method for optimistically adding onto that state. So your actual state is a list of 5 messages, and your optimistic state is a list of 6 messages. And when you go from that 5 to 6 and you hit enter, you immediately optimistically add that new state to it as well as you could throw a flag in there called pending or something like that if you want to show that it is currently pending. And then you go ahead and submit your action. And that optimistic state understands that there is an action being submitted inside of it. And once that action has successfully resolved, then you're back to a spot where your optimistic state and your actual state are the exact same thing. So there's only ever a little bit of time in between where your optimistic state and your actual state are going to be different. And all of the examples that I've seen so far, there's very few examples out there of people using this already. Usually what people are doing is just trying to replicate what it looks like that would come back from the server, but then throwing an extra flag variable on there being like, this is pending or this is optimistic. And then that way you can show a spinner or something like that. What I have not found is any patterns for showing how to like roll it back. Like what does that look like when it fails?
That was something that Apollo did really well.
Yes.
For GraphQL, they had nice docs for optimistic rollbacks. I've done that myself, but it's kind of a tricky UX thing in general because like what do? You pop it out of the list, you resubmit. Like there are UX considerations there that I think are a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit more deep than just, hey, do it for me, Exactly.
I think that's why it doesn't do any of that.
Yeah, I'd assume so.
Because you have to put that own logic in your action. So again, the way that this will generally work is that you take your existing action and you call that action from within your new optimistic action. And the logic of what to do when it fails and retries will be coded into your optimistic action. So instead of taking your existing server action and piping it directly into a form input, you're sort of wrapping it in. You're wrapping both your state and your action in useOptimistic hook, and then that will allow you to add your custom logic in there and proxy through your optimistic state. So that is action. Everything we've touched upon so far is React only. It pairs really well with working with caches. So we're seeing Next.js has this idea of a cache and a cache clearing. And what that will allow you to do is if you have a list of 7 items on a page and one of your actions is to update or delete one of those items or to add a new one, you always get into this weird situation where, especially with pagination, where, okay, well, that now is done. I need to refetch the data that is on that page. And in SvelteKit, we have this as well. And I think the SvelteKit approach is just, it invalidates the entire page and just sort of like refetches all of the data on that page. I think that's right. Is that right, Scott?
Yeah. You could do it different ways. Like you could push into an array instead of just grabbing a whole new array of data. I think grabbing a whole new array of data is fine. But yeah, we're just invalidating the page or that specific data with a query param.
Oh yeah. So the Next.js approach to this is currently it's just like a URL or a route to invalidate, which I don't love because I don't know what page I'm on. When I'm writing a component, the server action doesn't come with the current page that you're on. So it's kind of hard to do that type of thing. However, they have like this unstable cache API, which is much better. And the way that works is you can tag your caches with a bunch of different tags. Like you could say like items, item page 2, items sports, and then you can invalidate a tag. And you say, wherever these items are being used in the cache right now, that just blow them out and refetch them. And that API to me is awesome because most likely what you're going to do is somebody's going to submit a form that either creates a new item, updates an item, or deletes an item. And you're going to want to say, all right, well, I saved it. Now what I want to tell the client to do is refetch the list of items that are on that specific page. And that API is pretty slick.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's you're right. That's 90% of the time what you're going to, maybe 99% of the time what you're going to be doing here. So cool. Well, that was super informative. I think this sort of world where we're talking about actions, whether that, is the remix flavor of it, the Svelte flavor of it, or now the React server components or React flavor of it, is the right direction for me. This is the direction that I have been waiting for. And React, I think for a long time, has kind of been on the we're making things hard for you kind of position for a lot of this, especially in regards to form handling and things like that. So for me, this is a step in the right direction for React. It's making something easier for me. Yeah, that's where I want to be in React land. I want it to get easier because, hey, we have powerful tools. Now let's make these powerful tools friendlier tools.
Big fan. Let's get into sick picks. What do you got for me today?
Yeah, we are headed to we're headed to Amsterdam and we're going to Florence and stuff because I'm speaking over there. And so we're doing a little bit of a 2-week vacation to bounce around Europe for a little bit. And one thing, when you have kids, you have car seats. How are you going to do that with kids in car seats? Well, that's not going to work very well. So we got these inflatable car seats, Wes. They're good. What? They're like booster chairs. Our kids are old enough for booster chairs, so they're not like a car seat that you'd put a 2-year-old in. Yeah. I'm calling it a car seat, but it's a booster seat because our kids have graduated to those. But you have an inflatable booster seat. How are you going to blow this thing up? Well, Courtney got this little miniature air pump. It's tiny. It's this tiny little air pump. And I have like a portable air pump that's about this big, that's USB powered. But this thing is literally like this big. And it has a built-in battery. So you charge it up and it can blow up an air mattress and all kinds of stuff. But specifically for us, we're going to be using it if we're renting a car or maybe we're even taking a taxi or something. We need to be able to quickly inflate these booster seats, deflate them, whatever. And it's just a little $23 little air pump. What a wild world. I just remember you'd be like pumping it by hand, would be, But yeah, this tiny little pump is really pretty amazing. We gave it a try last night for the first time and really stoked about it. So check it out. It's a tiny portable ultra mini air pump. Works really well.
That's awesome. It's wild how motor technology has improved in the last couple of years because you're starting to see products like this, like a tiny little pump. You're starting to see like the opposite, which is like people have luggage that you can suck the air out of the luggage so it compresses more, and you can now do that because you can put a tiny little pump inside of luggage. Or you're seeing these tiny little blowers that are like super powerful, or like Dyson hairdryer knockoffs that are relatively affordable because like motors and fans and pumps
and batteries
have gotten, and batteries as well. It's just like being able to pack a decent sized battery life in them. So like the motors are getting more efficient, the batteries are getting better, and you're starting to see all these really interesting new products. Yeah. I'm going to sick pick the Aver Media live streamer Cap 4K. So
what a name.
This is basically an alternative to a cam link. So I have been chasing some frame rate gremlins. This did not fix that. It's a Chrome issue at the end of the day, but I decided to keep this because the Cam Link 4K is a pain in the butt because it is USB-A and it's like a dongle. So if you're plugging a heavy HDMI into the Cam Link 4K and then you're trying to plug that into then you have to plug it into I don't have USB on my MacBook, so you got to have a converter or you plug it into a hub. And then the Cam Link 4K doesn't work with Thunderbolt 4 hubs, so you can't plug it into the hub. So I did a little bit of research, and this is the one that a lot of people are recommending. It's cheaper than the Cam Link 4K. It's a box, so it's not a dongle, right? It has an input and an output. You just use any USB-C cable, or not any USB-C cable, but a good USB-C cable. And I'm thinking about just mounting it directly to the camera itself. So that wherever I go, I just sort of have it. And it's been awesome. It's 60 frames a second on 1080p and 30 frames a second on 4K, which is, I think, the same as the Cam Link as well. Plug and play. It's been working great. And also, the other thing is, whenever I would open up my photo booth on Mac OS X, or what's it called? Mac OS.
Mac OS. Yeah.
I would have to like change to a different camera and then back to the cam link to get it to work for whatever reason. So there's just like little gremlins with the cam link that I was having. Not enough to be too much of an issue, but if you don't have something and you're looking at buying it, the cam link 4K has been out for like 8 years and hasn't been updated. This thing is awesome, good, really affordable, and it works really well. I ran it for, I don't know, probably 30 hours straight. I also tested a bunch of the Amazon like knockoff ones just because like I had one lying around because it's like $20 as like a backup. The color on it is there's I think there's latency, but the color is awful. Yeah. Like I didn't think that would matter, you know, but I don't know how video compression works.
Yeah. Also, I don't necessarily know how capture cards work. I had no idea you would have done anything like affecting color, but I guess that's why you do not go with the cheapos.
Yeah, I guess because it needs to change it from an HDMI stream to whatever a webcam is looking for. So it literally has to do something. There's chips in them. That's why they're expensive, right? It's not just a converter where wires get connected to wires. So I was impressed I was surprised that the knockoff one looks so terrible.
Word. Cool. Well, I like this. I have one Cam Link 4K and one Cam Link that's like a billion years old. So maybe I should upgrade my non 4K one to something that does 4K as well, considering camera's nice. So yeah.
All right, that's it for today. Anything else?
No, thanks so much, Wes. I thought this was really, really super great. Yeah, I look forward to giving all this stuff a rip.
All right. Peace.
Peace.